There is chaos in Persona 4 Arena. I could say the same about almost any anime fighter, but even in this chaotic subgenre, Persona 4 Arena stands apart, and that might not be a good thing. Anime fighters can be quite different from one another, but they all share a few rules about how things should work. We don't walk, we double jump, and we air dash. But anime rules cover more than just movement. There's a way that we expect pressure to work. Many fighting games like to keep pressure short and snappy. A few blocked buttons will push the character far away, where it's too difficult to claim that it's definitely still your turn. In fighting games like these, you're not supposed to be pressuring for very long. Anime fighters are the complete opposite. Blocked buttons still have pushback, but the characters in these games are equipped with multiple ways to keep their pressure going. In anime fighters, long pressure is embraced, and although it isn't as respected as much as something like good neutral, good pressure often still involves strong decision making. Here's some very basic rules behind good starter pressure in most anime fighters. Use frame traps to beat mashing, use an overhead if they're not mashing, and use a throw if you think they're looking for the overhead. Creating the type of pressure that will beat a good player requires ideas that go deeper, but even so, good pressure still tends to reference the basics. Here's one clip that I enjoy watching back, a moment where I chased my opponent through the air to land this mid-air command grab. On one level, I think it just looks cool, however, I mostly like this clip because this grab, and the big damage that followed, felt like my reward for having a deeper understanding of this game's pressure and capitalizing on it. During this pressure sequence, my opponent was committed to blocking and holding down a mechanic that pushes me further away, implying that he'd like distance to be his means for escaping pressure. You know, kind of like Street Fighter. That's why I used this shadow clone to close the gap that had quickly formed. However, a few buttons later, with my opponent still committed to his plan, the gap had reappeared. My character can't use shadow clones twice in a row, and I stopped pressing buttons, so it looked like my pressure was over. That made it the ideal time for my opponent to make his escape, so he chose one of his character's strongest defensive options, jumping. Of course, just because I stopped pressing buttons didn't mean that the pressure was actually over. You know what happens next, and it only happened because I was thinking over all the factors I just explained. It's a satisfying instance of thinking like your enemy and having it pay off. Yet, even amongst pressure as game-specific and matchup-specific as this, it still pays reference to the first basic rule that I mentioned. Use frame traps to beat mashing. I know Smash players watch my videos, so I do want to clarify what I mean by frame trap. Here, it's basically a gap that is big enough to let the opponent press something, but small enough to counter them if they actually do press anything. My entire example falls apart without this basic rule. If my block string is tight, without gaps, I can't actually tell whether or not my opponent is mashing. If they are, nothing actually happens on screen, but whether or not frame traps actually catch someone mashing isn't the point. Regardless of the outcome, when I use frame traps, it gives me reliable information to start with. And in this case, that was my opponent is definitely not hitting buttons. And from there, I was able to build on that. No matter how layered pressure can be in these anime fighters, it's still merely a few basic rules that are often holding all of it together. But that's exactly why it's so earth-shattering when you run into a character with an instant DP, and suddenly, every rule you've ever learnt about how pressure should work in these games is just thrown out the window. First, what is an instant DP? Flash kicks, DPs on modern controls, Laundrekia, all of it counts. When I say instant DP, I mean a DP that can be executed in one frame. Essentially, a DP that only requires a button tap. Flash kicks are just DPs as a down-to-up charge input. These do require the player to hold down for several frames beforehand, but in practice, charge characters are usually always holding down, so their flash kicks operate very similarly to a button tap DP. Instant DPs differ from regular DPs because the traditional and most common DP motion, this Z motion, requires a minimum of 3 frames to execute, but in practice it's going to take even longer. That executional difficulty makes it even harder to casually execute a DP during the heat and speed of a match. This input is surprisingly easy to fumble, and it's still going to be awkward 10 years down the line, trust me. Under that traditional motion, hitting someone with a DP during a match often requires dedicating a portion of your mental stack to that particular situation. Meanwhile, one of the biggest strengths of an instant DP is their reliability even when your focus is elsewhere. It is significantly easier to quickly react to a new and sudden situation with a button tap than it is to react with forward, down, down, forwards. And if you have an instant DP in your arsenal, it'll really mess with people's ability to pressure you. Let's talk about frame traps again. Usually, players first discover frame traps as the effective counter to people mashing during your pressure, but that's a very direct view of the purpose that frame traps serve. We could look a bit more abstract. Frame traps are a fantastic, low-risk, low-reward tool. When you're unsure of how your opponent behaves while defending, it'll help you safely observe what they do. Frame traps are comfortable. Pressure tools like overhead mix-ups or throws are less safe, often leaving the player slightly vulnerable before they actually work. They're riskier to use. However, they are still more effective at breaking the opponent's defense, so they're more rewarding pressure tools. Frame traps are low reward because they struggle to achieve anything on their own. There is no threat if the opponent is content to patiently block. Hence, frame traps are low risk but low reward. Yet, against an instant DP, that balance is completely ruined. Frame traps work because they are gaps in pressure. These are acceptable gaps, sometimes as small as 2 or 3 frames that people just can't DP reliably. It is too difficult. You'd likely eat a hit because you pressed forward trying to do the DP motion. However, against an instant DP, there's no such thing as an acceptable gap. Any gap is an easy target for an instant DP that could change the tides of the game. The pressure sequence I covered near the start of the video is just not going to work against a character with an instant DP. There's too many openings. Instant DPs depower the safety and value of frame traps. Suddenly, they're not as low risk as they used to be, but unfortunately they're still low reward. Of course, other pressure basics are just not the same in the face of an instant DP. Someone with an instant DP doesn't need to search for the right overhead animation or throw, they'll just DP whatever mix-up you're throwing at them, and they'll win. Sometimes fighting games do have universal mechanics that also grant full invulnerability at the tap of a button, but have you noticed that these mechanics usually have a lengthy startup or a lengthy recovery? Maybe it's to avoid the same feeling people have when they deal with instant DPs. Trying to pressure this kind of defensive tool is suffocating. It requires a brand new approach that many players aren't prepared for and many others just don't enjoy. But hey, on the bright side, at least these characters are usually a very small minority of the roster. Except for in Persona 4 Arena, a fighting game from Arc System Works where every single character has an instant DP. Whenever I talk about Persona to the interested, I try to avoid mentioning that this game has instant DPs because I know it can be a turnoff. It's one of Persona's many controversial mechanics. In this game, DPs aren't their own special moves in the command list that some characters may have while others do not. Instead, it's a universal mechanic called Furious Action. So everybody has a DP. It comes free with your Persona 4 Arena. You execute it by pressing B plus D, which I had to look up because I never actually pressed those 2 buttons. Look, I'm a pad player. It's just L1 in my head. I don't know what stick players do, but please tell me. ArcSys had already made fine fighting games with Guilty Gear and BlazBlue, where DP inputs were still their traditional motions. So why does Persona 4 Arena break the mold? Well, I started writing this video in March 2021. Yeah, it's been a while, but I saved every article I found where Persona's developers explained the design decisions behind the game. Yet unfortunately, none of them actually talk about Furious Action and why it exists. It isn't something inherited from the RPG like All Out Attacks, so it wasn't about paying reference. However, I think we have enough information to assume that Furious Action exists for accessibility. What they have said many times is Persona 4 Arena was designed with Persona fans in mind. And I just want to quickly say, that didn't trigger any red flags at the time, but Persona is just scroll and click, so if this game was coming out today and they said that in an interview, I can only imagine the horrors they'd come up with. Persona 4 Arena is one of those fighting games that want to ease beginners into the experience while still having enough depth to keep fighting game veterans happy. But this game is from over 10 years ago, when most fighting games still hadn't made those kinds of accommodations for beginners. Fun fact, 2 years ago, Kazuhisa Wada, Persona 4 Arena's producer, said in an interview that Persona 4 Arena was the pioneer of the auto combos that are standardized today in fighting games. And you know what, let's let him have it. Persona needs something, it deserves something. For what it's worth, I still think Persona did the whole easy for beginners, deep enough for veterans thing better than any other fighting game has yet to do, but I'm digressing. This is about Persona 4 Arena and the wrath of instant DP. For accessibility, Persona 4 Arena doesn't have any difficult motion inputs. There are no Dragon Punch motions and there are no half circle motions. It's only quarter circles, charge motions, and the occasional down-down motion. Now down-down motions are easy, I'm not going to let anyone tell me otherwise. Removing difficult motion inputs helps prevent that unwelcoming feeling some people get when their input just doesn't come out right. However, the removal of the Dragon Punch motion is also the removal of the Dragon Punch. So, Furious Action, a universal DP mechanic, is here as the substitute. Now here are the consequences. Talking about the consequences of instant DP in Persona 4 Arena can get a little blurry. It's tough for me to make sweeping statements about instant DPs in this game because although it is a universal mechanic, it is wildly different amongst the cast. Narukami has the closest thing to a traditional DP, good for him. Then you get DPs like Elizabeth's, a 24 frame startup grab that you can tech. Ken's DP has so much recovery that he might just get instant killed if it's blocked. How's that for risk reward, you war crime of a character? Lapras DP is so slow that you can be asleep and still counter it on time. Shadow Lapras DP is actually good though, lucky her. Getting DP'd by Chie could cost half of your health, or you could get DP'd and literally not care because this DP is both great and terrible. Alright, this is kind of fun, I'm just going to keep going. Adachi's DP is an overhead into a low. I mean, it's an okay DP, but this knowledge check is just stupid. Margaret's DP is also a grab that can be teched, but at least it has 10 less frames of startup than her little sisters. Also, it's a bloody suplex. You can see why it's tough to make generalizations about instant DPs in this game. The precautions you take while pressuring a character like Narukami are nothing like the precautions you take while pressuring a character like Elizabeth. But to be clear, if you play Persona, you will get DP'd. There is no magic pressure, no option select you can use to stop these instant DPs from being a constant threat. No matter how good you are, you're gonna get DP'd. We're all getting DP'd. It looms over Persona 4 Arena's gameplay, and with that in mind, how does the presence of instant DP mess with the common rules of anime pressure? Pressure in Persona is not completely foreign, but there are a few noticeable adjustments. The first difference is that frame traps are far less common. I generally love how useful frame traps are in any other game. Like I said, they're low reward but they're also low risk, and they're just a great way to safely observe an opponent's defensive habits. But that doesn't quite pan out in Persona. As I said before, instant DPs interfere with that risk-reward balance and depower the effectiveness of a frame trap. Persona players aren't willing to leave gaps in their pressure because it's so easy to get punished for it. Tight block strings are more common in Persona 4 Arena than any other fighting game that I've played. And you may notice that if block strings are tight, some of the basic rules to anime pressure that I mentioned at the start of the video are now a bit redundant. Like this one, use a throw if you think they're looking for the overhead. You can't throw someone if you keep your block strings tight. In fact, you can't do much at all with your pressure if you keep your block strings tight. That kind of pressure often has no purpose. It's kind of like filler pressure. Filler pressure is what I imagine all anime pressure looks like to people who don't actually play these games. A bunch of buttons just being pressed while their opponent waits for the assault to end. That's usually not the case in these anime fighters, but admittedly, Persona steps into that sometimes. That's not a terrible thing. I can only speak on my own experience, but I've never actually minded or really noticed these moments. Filler pressure never lasts very long, and it isn't very effective, so it's not really a big deal. To create pressure that really is threatening, players have no choice but to leave gaps, even amidst the threat of instant DP. One of the other basic rules in anime pressure I mentioned was use an overhead if they are not mashing. Persona 4 Arena actually has a universal overhead mechanic called All Out Attack, another combination of buttons that I've simply mapped to R1. All Out Attack is a reference to the original RPG, but you may as well view it like dust from classic Guilty Gear. Everyone has an overhead, it's too slow to use very often, but good enough to sometimes catch a player off guard. However, there's a strange property to All Out Attacks. They have super armor, which is kind of odd. It's just an overhead. In a vacuum, nothing about it necessitates giving it super armor, just like there's no reason to give super armor to Dust. But in the context of Persona 4 Arena, and the situation created by easy instant DPs, that super armor might be necessary. I can't say with certainty that instant DPs are the reason that all-out attacks have super armor, and in practice, sometimes all-out attacks still lose to instant DPs, but if there is any particular reason that all-out attacks have super armor, this is the best one I can think of. Generally though, all-out attacks are too slow and too unsafe to have a real presence in Persona's pressure anyway. So if Persona players aren't pressuring in traditional ways because of instant DP, what are they doing instead? They are jumping. A lot. Jump cancels are like a weaker version of frame traps to Persona 4 Arena. That might not make sense immediately, so let me explain. Jump cancels are kind of like a low risk, low reward tool to rely on. When you're unsure of how your opponent behaves while defending, jump cancels can help you safely observe what the opponent is doing while you still continue your own pressure. When you jump, your momentum is set. It will barely change. That means you can jump in the direction of your opponent while still holding back to block. With a setup like this, if the opponent DPs, you're able to block it, but if the opponent continues to block, you're able to land with a button and continue your pressure. At its base, it's a pretty simple idea. What's even nicer, Persona 4 Arena lets you manually turn around in the air, and with this mechanic, jump cancelling in Persona offers more flexibility than a jump cancel in most other fighting games. There's more cross-ups and a bunch of other character-specific ideas. But of course, since jump cancels became a prominent pressure tool, Persona's meta evolved to counter it. While defending, Persona players often expect to see the opponent jump cancel, so they're ready to beat it with an anti-air, which are entirely air unblockable in this game. There's no faultless defense or barrier block to save you. But of course, since many players are ready to anti-air those jump cancels, many Persona players take extra steps during pressure to jump cancel, and then double jump to bait a potential anti-air. But of course, since some players don't want to deal with that situation at all while defending, there's an option select some people have where they'll just immediately jump and air throw to beat jump cancels. At a certain point, you have to take a step back and see how ridiculous this looks. Like, how did we get here? Really, we've suddenly got players jumping and dashing far away during their own pressure, and we've got people tossing out air throws in the most random looking ways that you'll never see in other anime fighting games. No, not even in Guilty Gear. Is it possible that a single change, like removing the DP motion, caused all of this? Well, here's my theoretical timeline of what happened after Arc System Works agreed to make a Persona 4 Arena fighting game. Persona fans will play Persona 4 Arena. For accessibility, motion inputs are simplified. Because difficult motions are gone, DPs become a universal mechanic. Now that DPs are easy to input, frame traps are largely sidelined. A simple universal overhead mechanic now needs frickin' super armor. Players constantly jump during their pressure, and jumps are so common that people are now randomly air throwing all about the place. You know, luckily, I think that's just funny. It's not bad. Learning to do good pressure in Persona 4 Arena can feel totally foreign, and I doubt that was the intention, but luckily, Persona's still a fun fighting game, despite how the DPs work. But every fighting game is quite different. It's gotta be near impossible to predict every single consequence of removing the DP motion from a particular game. A fighting game can be good without the DP motion. I think Persona is a shining example, but it's an absolute guarantee that a fighting game will at least be different if that motion is removed. How different? Unsurprisingly, that depends on the game, but different can be all it takes to unintentionally alienate most of your players. I'm not in love with the DP motion, I still drop it more than I'd like, and I'm sure many other players do as well. And if I have to put up with sometimes dropping my DP input to preserve the gameplay that I currently love, then you know what? I can live with it. Thank you for getting to the end of the video. This was a tough one, but I enjoyed it and I hope you did as well. I was sick recently, I feel better now, but I don't think my voice got the memo, so I hope I didn't sound too weird or nasally. I'd massively appreciate it if you left a comment, if you left a like, and if you hadn't already, if you subscribe. Though most importantly, have a nice day.